Some of the stories that you told in the first interview that we did, and one of the stories was about how you first got into modeling and how you first got into making shapes.
Oh, the first sculpture I did, yeah. Well, when I was 9 years old, I remember I had had an illness of some sort, and I was still in bed, but I was getting better, and somebody brought me a package of chewing gum, and I had chewed the gum, and so one day I chewed up the whole package, and I modeled my dog, and that was really my start. And my parents then got me some plastiline, and I remember I made a whole bunch of little animals, and that was, I've been doing sculpture ever since, really. Yeah.
And then there was a long period of time between that first modeling of the animal to where you really thought, hey, I want to dedicate my life to art.
That's right. I was modeling and whittling and so on, intermittently drawing a lot. I always drew a lot in those days, and I somehow grew up without realizing that this was something one could do in one's life as the main part of one's life, and I remember how I used to, while I was in school and college, I didn't know what I was going to do when I got out. None of the conventional professions appealed to me, and so I just went along, and then just about the end of my college career, I met by chance a young fellow who was a painter, David Park, and he was only 17 or so at the time, and but he was already an artist. He wasn't going to be an artist, he was one. That was his life. And I went with him to sketch classes and visited artist friends of his and so on, and the first thing I knew, I knew what I wanted to do. Yeah.
But didn't you try some other endeavors before you got into art? Didn't you work on a sailing vessel? Not a sailing vessel.
Well, they weren't vocational things. They were just enthusiasms of youth, I guess. I remember I read Zane Grey, some of those early novels of Zane Grey, Riders of the Purple Sage and so on, and nothing would do but that I become a cowboy. And so I was able to get a job on a ranch in Arizona, the cattle ranch that was based near Flagstaff. And I was there for almost a year. And during that year, I remember we went out on the chuck wagon to round up the calves for shipping, the yearlings, and we were out on that wagon for almost 3 months, and we had 8 or 10 cowboys, and each one had a string of horses, 10 or a dozen horses, and my job was to take care of the horses. Every day I would take them out. I had to get up at 3 in the morning, and I'd get on my pony and go. I remember I hadn't the slightest idea where the horses would be, but my horse did, and I would just slip the bridle on and hang on to my horse, and I remember I'd slide over the way the Indians do, one side or the other, as we went under the branches of pine trees, close to the pine trees, to keep from getting knocked off by the limbs. And we'd find the horses and bring them in, and then the men would rope the horses they wanted, and then I'd take them out to graze, keep an eye on them, keep them together.
How old were you when you were doing that?
I was 18 or 19, yeah.
Were you?
I took a year out of school there, and did that, yeah.
Didn't you spend some time at sea also?
And then, yes, that also came from my reading Joseph Conrad and some of the great sea stories, Moby Dick, and I nothing would do then but that I go to sea. So I did. I got a job just in those days you could go down and we didn't, that was before the unions even, I guess, and you could go down and get signed on a ship, and I made several coastal trips on lumber boats up to Vancouver and up in that area, down to San Pedro, and then I got on one of the around the world dollar liners. And
what's that?
With the President Adams, and went around the world. The dollar line was a famous line of steamships, freighters they were, but they sometimes carried half a dozen passengers, but they were strictly freight boats. And so I had a good taste of that, and at what age were you doing that? I guess I was about 20 when I did that. I did that in between my sophomore and junior year at college. I took a year.
So is that, do you know the expression, the Wunderjahr? Wunderjahr German?
I guess not, Paul.
Well, what it means is you take a break from what
yeah.
Go wander for a year.
Yes, now I understand the word, wanderlust, yes. Yeah.
So did you eventually go back to college? Did you finish
I went
college?
back to college, went back to, my first 2 years were at Occidental College, and then I went to, and between Occidental and Berkeley, I went to Berkeley for the last 2 years. I went to sea, and
well, anyway, after you finished college, then what did you do?
And then, just in that last 6 months of college, I had met David Park, a young painter, and one day he took me. We went to San Francisco, and he took me in to visit the studio of Ralph Stackpole, the sculptor in San Francisco. And I'll never forget, I stepped in through the little gate in the board fence across the front of the work area there between two big brick buildings, stepped into this sculptor's yard with a derrick and big stones and carved stones around, all sorts of, and I just knew I was home. I knew that was it. So I talked to Ralph Stackpole and came back and saw him several times, and he was just starting on his great commission for the stock exchange building in San Francisco. And so I went to work as a kind of lowly helper, sweeping up and doing all odd jobs in the studio, and as I gradually learned to do different things, I did more and more important things, making molds for the small models he made for the large sculpture, and later on working, learning to temper and sharpen tools, and eventually to do work on the actual sculptures on the building. And I was there 2.5, almost 3 years, and that was my training. And during that period, I got to know many artists there in San Francisco in those days, the early 30s, and in fact we were there in 1929 working on the Stock Exchange building when the crash came, and that was a great experience. I both learned a lot about my craft and learned how to work and what it meant. I developed work habits there that have stayed with me all my life.
Well, I'm curious about that. How did Ralph Stackpole work? Did he get in there early and just work all day, and or did he work half days, or?
Well, he worked intermittently on the building, and he had we several stone cutters, and he did mainly checking up measurements and proportions and things like that, be sure everything was where it was supposed to be, and he'd help establish points to work to, like the tip of a shoulder or some outstanding feature, and then we worked with did the roughing out just with a 3-pound hammer and a big hand point chisel, and and then we used air hammers with to refine the forms. The sculptures are I'm sure Stackpole, from his days in France, had been an admirer of Bourdelle, and there's a reflection of that work. It helps describe it in a way.
Well, what are the personal work?
Your microphone's creeping in.
Oh. Eric is just going to keep on, changing tapes and going to the next tape, but if you're saying anything that I really think I'll use or anything that I really like, I may ask you to just hold the thought for a minute, okay?
Okay. Their experience with you, so I feel a little more relaxed, but
yeah, you look good.
I'm having a little trouble. I keep thinking I'm repeating myself, remembering the other, and I guess that doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't, but I'll just kind of guide you along.
Okay.
We'll keep it moving. Okay, we were talking about the specific pieces that you worked on, and what are the work ethics that you use personally in your work that you learned working at Stackpole's? Are we rolling?
Yep.
I don't hear it.
Good.
Rolling. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think that a very important thing for any young man is to have training to learn some craft, whether it's carpentry or cabinet making or anything, mechanics, auto mechanics, or machine shop work, and thereby develop a standard of craft in a way. And I got that working there. I learned to do whatever I was doing properly as well as I could, and I think that's a very important thing. And having the experience of learning a craft, you then apply that to whatever you do, so you maintain the same standards, and that was a very important thing. And then I think I learned a lot about how to approach a project, anything from some small thing one was going to do or a big commission piece, how to go about it, and just from being there and seeing Stackpole work, and I remember he made many models. He developing his theme and getting it to what was to him an acceptable stage. And then the architect, Tom Pfluger, would come in and they'd have big discussions and talk about it, and I would have to cast all these models in plaster. He did them in clay. And
so through doing that, you learn the art of mold making.
That's right, yeah. And I learned how to use plaster of Paris, casting plaster, and it's a very valuable tool in a way. You can do many things with it, and I've used it all my life. Many of the new plastics are used today, but plaster is still the most versatile and perhaps the best for many things.
Now, when did you first, well, I know you probably came here to visit as a young man. I think you said your family used to come through here. But when did you first make the decision that you'd like to live in this area?
Well, it was during that period in San Francisco that I came to Carmel with a friend I'd made at Berkeley. His family had a cabin or small house here in the Carmel woods, and we came down and spent a weekend, and I was and during that weekend we made we went in an automobile down the coast. We didn't get all the way to Big Sur. It took 3 or 4 hours to get to Big Sur then.
What year was that, do you recall?
That was in 1930, I think.
And the Coast Highway was built a few years later?
A few years later, yeah. And the old road went in and out, you know, and all the canyons and up over the hills and so on. And at any rate, I saw enough of Big Sur to I never could forget it. And so when the Stackpole project came to an end, Stackpole went to France, and so I came to Carmel and spent a good part of 2 or 3 years here, and going down the coast a lot. And it was in that period my first job was as a laborer for M.J. Murphy, and I've always remembered the terrible case of poison oak I got digging ditches for a house down on the edge of the point there.
And in that time when you were a laborer, were you also working?
I was working, yeah. I was working at my own work doing sculpture. And of course, I wasn't getting much reward for it, but it was during that period that I became acquainted with Edward Weston. My studio was, or my little place where I lived was up back of the original forge in the forest where what's the grocery store?
Bruno's?
Bruno's now is. And I would be carving on a piece of Carmel Valley sandstone out there in the yard, and Edward would walk by with his walking stick, and he'd stop, and we became acquainted gradually, and we had some good talks there, and he was always very encouraging to me. And
did you live right there?
What?
Did you live right there?
I lived right there. There was an old stable there that has no longer in use, and I had fixed up a corner of that, boarded it up, and made a little living room, and then I had plenty of room to work. Really under the building, it was up on posts, and I lived upstairs, and and John Catlin was the blacksmith that originated the Forge in the Forest. And I remember I used to have breakfast with him in his loft up in the forge every morning. We'd have canned tamales and canned grapefruit and tea for breakfast.
You're talking about the time when you were living at the Forge in the Forest, and I asked you, we're going? Whether, how Carmel was different then, and this was in the early 30s, I presume.
I remember that the post office was on Dolores Street, and in the middle of the morning, all the residents of Carmel would come down to the post office, and that was really the newspaper. Even though there was the pine cone, that people met and exchanged gossip and communicated in one way and another, and Carmel really had a cohesive feeling. It was a group. Just one knew of almost everyone that was in the town. And
did you ever attend any of the plays at the Forest Theater?
Yes, yes.
Is there anyone that you remember? Productions?
I remember more of the Golden Bough Theater, and in fact, at one time, just for one play, I worked the lighting for Chekhov's play, The Seagull, and that was a wonderful experience for me. I got an understanding of the theater. Maury Ankrum was the director at that time, and he had quite a professional career and went on to Hollywood later and so on, and up there where I worked the lights, I got to watch all the rehearsals, and they'd go over and over these things, and I began to understand the importance of stage direction and voice control and all of this sort of thing, and theaters had a great deal more meaning to me because of that.
Well, also it was in an age where we don't have the mass media that we have today. Everybody did not have a television set. In fact, there was no television.
That's right.
There was no VCRs.
Yeah.
There was probably one movie theater.
Yeah, I don't think there was a movie theater in Carmel.
Well, so that was the only media.
In Monterey, perhaps there was. In fact, I don't have any recollection of going to the movies then.
Well, you know, they probably everybody probably came to see the plays.
Yeah.
Since they were
yeah. The house, we had the full house every time.
Okay.
Ted Custer was the proprietor of the theater and was very active in it, and yeah.
Then, so when you were living at the Forge in the Forest, did you move out of the area for a while after you?
Yeah. Then I went to Southern California, and I was continued my work, and I secured a teaching post at Occidental College in sculpture, and then a year later at Chenard's Art School, and I taught for several years there, three or 4 years, and until I decided that I wanted so badly to get back to Big Sur that I left those things and went back to Big Sur, though that was a very fruitful time. It was the Federal Art Project, the Depression and the Federal Art Project came into being, and I participated there, and
how did that work, Gordon?
Well, uh, artists that qualified got a weekly or monthly minimal pay, enough to live on, and did work that was put in schools and post offices and all such things. There's a little mural in the Pacific Grove post office that was from those days, and it was a wonderful period. John Steinbeck did some work, was able to continue his work for one period because of the WPA.
Oh, really? So they
Yeah.
gave it to writers as well?
Yeah, writers as well. There was a writers project and an artist project, and many artists whose names are remembered were helped in that period. Many of them otherwise might have had to give up because it was really a strenuous time, but also a wonderful time.
Do you remember any of the pieces that you worked on in that period? And are they still around?
There's one piece that I worked on. There were 5 sculptors. Arch Garner, who lived here for many years, and George Stanley and Jay Owen, and I forgot who the 5th one was. Arnold Forrester, an Austrian, and we did a monument to astronomy at the planetarium in Griffith Park, and the monument was in the shape of a big star going up a tapering column, and in the recess between each one of the points of the star, each one of us had one of the figures of a prominent astronomer, and I had Kepler, and these were, I don't remember, 8 or 10 foot figures that we modeled in clay and eventually cast in cement and installed. And that monument is still there. Yeah.
How about the pieces at the Pacific Stock Exchange? Are they still there?
They're still there. Yeah.
Do you ever go up there and look at them?
Oh, whenever I go to San Francisco, I like to go by and look at them. Get up, yeah.
That must be really something looking at them now, huh? Have they weathered at all?
No, I mean, I suppose there's a little accumulation of grime and so on from the city, but you're not really aware of it when you look at them. And they're granite. They're just going to be there forever if they're left alone. They don't deteriorate. Yeah.
So what happened after that? I mean, how many years were you in Los Angeles before you moved back here?
I came back in 1937. I came back to Big Sur, and I had managed to get a little piece of property in Big Sur, and I started building a house. And I did it the hard way. There was a great redwood that was down, that had fallen in the canyon, and I cut it up into 14-foot lengths, and then split with wedges and sledgehammers these big slabs of wood out, 4 inches thick and 12 inches wide, and I designed and built a house mainly out of that material. And I remember those big 4-inch thick timbers were heavy because the wood was still full of sap, was still green, and I'd drag them up the hill behind my pickup to get them up to the site.
Is that house still standing?
That house is still standing there. When my marriage with Amelia broke up, she, of course, kept the house, but she left it to our children, Gretchen and Hal, and they have decided to keep it as a family house, so we all can go down and share it and enjoy it at times. And my grandson lives there now.
Oh, great. It's great that it's still in the family. Okay, just this last week I've been among the paintings of Armin Hansen and William Reichel.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Armin Hansen. And did you ever see him work? I mean, while he was at work, while he was working on a project.
Well, I never really saw him work.
Mm-hmm.
I went into his studio. I remember being taken in with someone to his studio, and he stopped painting, and we talked, you know. But I remember him as a large man. He was a big man, and very affirmative, and just a wonderful man and artist.
Where was his studio?
Up in the Carmel Woods, as I remember, someplace. Yeah. And then Paul Doherty was way up in the Highlands, and John O'Shea was down below the highway in the Highlands. You can see his house from the road, get a glimpse of it when you go by. And William Ritchell built that great castle on the point. Incidentally, and he was the main part of the house. There's a large, great room, which in most houses would probably be the living room. That was his studio, and he had several easels with big canvases on them and working. And I remember he advised me to submit work to the National Academy, and that success would depend on the acceptance there. And the National Academy of Design, I guess it's called. And I never did, but it became a different time in a way, I think. And but he had that great house, and then Nora, his wife, was a very beautiful woman, and she just loved gardening and all, and she just had flowers and all growing everywhere there. And incidentally, if you have an opportunity, you ought to visit that house now. Some people from, I don't recall the name, but she is a physicist from Caltech in Pasadena, and she and her family have bought that house and redid the interior. Did an extensive going over, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful place now. And in the speaking of sculpture, down in the garden, there is a very wonderful and expressive lion carved in high relief, just against the bank, sort of, and the plants growing around it. And he's just a tremendous sculptor, and William Ritchell did him.
Oh.
Yeah. And
okay, let's move on and talk about some of the pieces that you've done. I'd like you to talk a little bit about Yggdrasil. How did that commission come your way?
Well, Mr. Clements, Richard Clements, approached me and wanted to know if I'd be interested. He had a site down at his place in Big Sur at Partington Canyon that where he'd like to have a sculpture, and would I be interested to come down and see the site and consider it. So I did. We had lunch at the Clock, I think, and then we arranged to go down the coast a few days later, and this site was a great outcropping of granite right on the edge of the cliff in full view of from the living room of the home. And so I was just carried away by that. and so I was living in the desert at the time. I went back and I remember when we were together there at the house, he indicated his interest in Scandinavian mythology and so on. We talked about Beowulf and one thing another, and so I kind of took that as a theme, and it occurred to me that the Scandinavian myth of the tree that holds up the world would be appropriate for this site. And so I designed the tree to be made of steel that would hold up the big stone that would be the world, the carved stone. And I made a drawing of this project as I visualized it, and he liked it very much. I brought it over, and so we went to work on it and did it there in Darwin, and brought it over, and we had to finally install it by helicopter. The cliff is so steep, the mountainside is so steep there, it was the only way to do it. So it was a very exciting.
How did you fasten it to the rock?
The stone just.
No, I mean the tree. How is it fastened to the rock?
We drilled holes in the granite, and 2 feet deep, and put steel pins in cement, and then where they came up out of the granite, we had planned so that the parts of the tree, the roots of the tree, could be welded to those pins, and so they were just welded. It's just absolutely secure there. And then the stone that the tree holds just fits in and lies there. It can't. It's just there.
So it's not glued in or
anything? No.
So where did you get that stone?
We quarried that stone from an abandoned dolomite quarry in the desert, not far from where my place is, in the desert there. And it's a beautiful white dolomite, which appears just like white marble, except that it has a sparkle, a little more sparkle to it. So it's just perfect for up there. And
what about that Corten steel?
Well, the Corten steel from which the tree is made is a steel that rusts only the first 2 years that it's out in the weather, and then it stops rusting. It never rusts further, and it worked out just perfectly, just as it was supposed to. There's just one little tiny trickle of stain over the edge of the rock where the first year a little of the rust was washed down, and it's become a very rich, beautiful, deep rust color, a little richer color than ordinary steel is when it's rusted.
Okay, great. I'd also like you to talk a little bit about the fountain. Let's talk about another one of your pieces, and that is the fountain pools. The ones in Washington, D.C.?
Oh.
I think they're called Haupt pools?
Yeah, the hopped pools.
Haupt pools.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an interesting project. The firm of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill were planning, doing a lot of planning for Washington, D.C., and among other things, planning making a master plan for Pennsylvania Avenue, and the hop pools weren't on that avenue, but they were on the ellipse circle between the White House and the Washington Monument, and they were to be seen from the Truman balcony of the White House, and they wanted to have these two large granite pools, 20 feet square, and they were the stones required were 20 feet square and 2 feet thick, and then a bowl hollowed out in them, and they were having trouble finding a quarry that could provide stone of that dimension that was free of flaws and so on, and it so happened that I knew where they could be had, and so I went to work on the project and went to spent several months in Minnesota while they were quarrying the stone and then shaping the pools and so on, and then they were to be shipped to Washington. They got these well cars, the bottoms of which are a few inches above the roadbed, and the stones were placed in the cars on edge and secured with welded 10-inch steel I-beams, and to avoid overpasses and tunnels they had to route the train through 6 different railroads, went way down through the south someplace and up to Washington, and also the train that they were on was restricted to 25 miles an hour and was not allowed to run at nighttime. It was quite a project from that point of view, and they got into Washington, and we had the crane come down and load them on lowboy trucks, and in the middle of the night, when there was no traffic, we delivered them to the site in the ellipse circle, and I remember the police cars and motorcycles and red lights flashing, and it was an exciting event for us. And then they had wanted a little of the work to be left to be done there in Washington on the site, and so Jim Hunault, a sculptor friend of mine, was my helper, and we worked there for several weeks, just finishing off the bowls in the pool, and then I remember the first snow came in on a storm, and the snow was just coming in horizontally, and well, that was the last day, the day we finished, and then we packed up our tools and things and left for the west, for California.
I remember seeing one of the pictures in the newspaper of that that you had saved from,
yeah.
I guess it was the early 60s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it looked like what you would do in order to make the pool is you would take out a little section of granite. Is that how you carved down little bites? The
way we carved it, to start out, they had a diamond saw on on a that they anchored in the center of the pool, and the saw was out at the edge of the circle, and they cut a groove with this diamond saw about 2 inches deep. And then we that gave us a start. Then we just worked that stone out back to that crack, and then we scribed circles every foot into the center of the pool, and on the outer circle we drilled holes, shallow holes, and then the next circle were a little deeper, and the next circle a little deeper, and the last circle they were about 18 inches deep. That gave us the, and then we, between those circles of holes, we did what is called channeling. We drill 2 small holes about 1.5 inches apart, and then with a big bit, like a 2-inch or 2.5-inch bit, we drill a hole in between them. And this large bit, because it was larger than the small holes, couldn't run over into the small holes, you see. And so what in effect you did, you made a trench all the way around, and then we could split out those pieces, and that left a rough bottom which we had to work down with air hammers and so on to an acceptable surface.
So you must have, that was a busy place. A lot of people must have come by to watch your work.
Oh yeah, we had a lot of senators and congressmen, and Lady Bird Johnson came down, and all, yeah.
That's great. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about if a young person came up to you and he said, I like to sketch and I like to draw, and I'm really drawn to a life in the arts. I don't know whether I want to paint but I sure love sketching. And what kind of advice would you give them to as far as getting involved in a life in the arts?
Well, I think I would tell them that it was fine to go ahead and pursue it if they were doing it because they wanted to do it. My thoughts along that line were that we only have one chance at it, and so we better do what we want to do. And that's what I chose. Much of my life has been pretty much hand to mouth, but it's been all right because I've been so deeply involved and happy in what I'm doing that accumulating money is not really that important. And I would advise young people that art is wonderful. If they want to do it, then they should do it. And one way or another, they'll probably find a way to survive. But it shouldn't be viewed as one shouldn't have to do it, as one has to go to work if one has a job, and so on. And one should do it out of their feeling, yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about Darwin and when you decided to go to Darwin, but first I want to talk about that piece called The Eagle for Robinson Jeffers, which is in the garden at Tor House.
Yes. Well, that was carved out of a piece of Texas, granite from Texas, kind of a pink and gray mixture stone. It's and I called it when I carved it an eagle for Robinson Jeffers. eagles and hawks having been such important symbols in his work. And so I was very happy to have it there in the garden. And the original owner was Ralph Atkinson. He had bought it directly from me and had it in his home in Big Sur, or Bixby Point, for a long time. And then it eventually came to Tor House.
You told me that you remember the first time that you ran into Robinson Jeffers. He was just somebody walking on the beach.
Yeah, I encountered him first just walking on the beach, scrounging for driftwood and special stones and things like that, in which we were both interested in, and we struck up a little acquaintance there, and so I was able to see him occasionally during the years, and though Robinson Jeffers was not one to talk about either his work or his thoughts about his work, but he was a very unique individual, and of course I feel he's maybe one of the very greatest American poets. And
I remember you telling me that you hit him up for a job one time. Was it because
I did.
you
He of course he developed that style of life of working on his poetry in the morning, and in the afternoon he'd do masonry, building his house and then his tower. And so I went down at one point and hit him up for a job as a helper with his masonry. And I remember he refused me, but as saying that he preferred to work alone, which I could understand, because I could see that it was from his work with these stones. During this period, his thoughts developed for his writing. And
do you remember the poem that you recited, the last tape? Do you still remember that poem?
Gee.
The Stonecutters?
Well, if I fumble it, you can cut this and take the other one.
Okay.
Do you want me to try it?
I'd like you to try it.
Okay. Stonecutters fighting time with marble. You four defeated challengers of oblivion eat cynical earnings. Knowing rock splits, records fall down, and the square-limbed Roman letters wear in the rain, scale in the thaws. And the poet as well builds this monument mockingly, for the blithe earth shall die, and the brave sun die blind, his heart blackening. Yet stones have stood for 1,000 years, and pained thoughts found the honey peace in old poems.
Yeah, you still do remember it. That's great. That's great. I love that poem too.
You know, that poem is really a meditation on the transiency of stone, which is the most enduring of all things in a way, you know. That's a wonderful way to have, I mean, who would think of stone and then think how that it doesn't last?
Yeah. Well, I remember one of the lines, it's hard to paraphrase poetry. I remember one of the lines from his poems where he talks about our great skyscrapers that we, you know, steel and glass that we see now, that steel is a relative of iron.
Yeah, that's right.
rust.
That's a wonderful poem.
And then someday they'll just be rust stains.
Stains of rust in the,
On heaps of plastic.
Yeah, that's another beautiful poem.
Let's see. Could you pause for a second? Have the things that come to mind about that? If not, that story would be fine.
Well, I've got that more clearly in mind than anything.
Okay.
Do
you remember what year it was? Or about what year?
Well, I can't remember whether it was like 1940 or just after the war, just at the beginning or just after.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, Steinbeck had he moved to Los Gatos at one point to get away from the Pisano life that he and his friends enjoyed here, and be freer to work. And I had occasion to go to San Francisco at one point, and on the way home I stopped in Los Gatos to see John. And I got in the late afternoon, and after dinner and visiting a while, I was ready to go to bed, and Carol went to bed. John said he was going to stay up and work a little while. And several hours later, I was awakened by John crying out, "I've got it, I've got it." And so I got up, Carol came out, and there was John. He had finally got an ending, which he'd been struggling for the Grapes of Wrath. And the scene, and he read it to us, the scene where the young mother gives her breast to the old man to keep him alive, to nourish him. Wonderful scene and a wonderful story, and I always remember that evening.
Did John ever talk about his work while he was working on it, or some artists prefer not to discuss their work or let anybody see their work till it's finished?
He didn't. I think he talked maybe with a few inmates, like probably with Doc at the lab there, and I don't know. But I remember he was talking about experiences of, he went over and spent a lot of time with the agricultural workers and so on, and got all this material firsthand, and he was very moved by it, and he used to talk about that, but not about how he was dealing with it.
Do you think that in the scenes in, like, for example, the Grapes of Wrath, that he would base a story on something that he actually saw? So it was more like a documentary than a fiction?
Well, I'm sure I know there's a lot of that in it, I think an artist he doesn't just report the incidents that may have impressed him, but he uses them as a starting point and develops or elaborates or sharpens or something like that.
I'm wondering how you approach a stone. I mean, do you have a project in mind and you go looking for a stone? Do you go looking at stones and maybe a stone you'll have some sort of reaction to it?
Well, there are different ways that one approaches a sculpture, and one of the ways is it's always wonderful to find a stone, to be going by the shore or up a stream bed or something, or out in the desert, and you see many stones. And one day you see one that for some reason stops you, and I don't know what it is. It's something about the shape or what that strikes a response, and if you get that stone, you usually can end up doing something with it. I think that the word creativity is bandied about way too much in connection with art. I think it's more a process of discovery. It's as though there were a hidden truth within the stone, and if you are successful, you find it and reveal it and so on.
Okay, that's great. Let's see, I'm trying to think about.
I've always thought of granite. I've just, ever since my first experience with Stackpole, that's where I learned to work granite, and I've loved it all my life, and I have always thought of it as perhaps the most enduring thing on our earth. And yet when our studio burned down on Cannery Row, I had almost a dozen good-sized granite sculptures that made me realize that fire is king. Fire rules. The granite becomes heated, and the stone gets hot, and then it begins to expand, and it pops off the surface. And then the new surface gets hot, and it begins to expand and breaks loose from the matrix. And pretty soon there's just a pile of rubble. And that was a very difficult thing in a way for me to face and accept. Well, the fire is certainly a disaster, but I think it's, an artist is fortunate in that he has something that he wants to do, so it's easier for him to pick up again and go on. I mean, you've lost some things, but more important are some things you want to do.
Let's talk about the piece that you're working on right now, that white piece that we looked at. Now, is your way of working, you get up in the morning and you go and you start hammering on that thing?
Yeah.
And how long do you do it?
I work only about 2 hours now. 2 to 3 hours a day I used to work all day, but I have to stop. I can go ahead and work all day, but if I do, then it takes me several days to recover, where I can't work at all. Because I just don't have the...
Well, you're at that age now where a lot of people think about slowing down anyway.
Yeah, well, you slow down a little, there's no question.
And how long will it take for, at that rate, a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours a day, to go from a stone that you picked up somewhere to a finished piece? For example, on this...
Well, this piece, I suppose, it'll be between, I'll have worked on it between 2 and 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And will you work on it exclusively, or do you have other?
No, then if I stop in time, I come in and take a rest, and then I go out and I work with plaster or clay, developing further ideas, or just some project I'm interested in, or designs or whatnot. There's always something to do, so I can keep busy that way.
So you pretty much put in a full day every day?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay. I think that's about it.
Individual piece. And is there something been through the years that...
Well, I could certainly say that Robinson Jeffers has been he has meant a great deal to me in my life, and his poetry, his verse, some of it is Uh, well,
You seem to sculpt a lot of natural forms like the birds.
I love the natural forms, and my work many times is quite abstract. And in fact, I've done some things that are non-objective, but I find it more satisfying when there is some reference to the forms of nature and so on. And I think that people can relate to that.
It's sort of a universal
Yeah.
appeal to them. Okay, now Gordon, what kind of stone is this that you're working on right now?
This is a piece of Carrara marble, Paul.
How did you come by that piece?
It was part of a large block that I got sometime in the past, and I split a part of it off to make the block proper proportion for another carving, and this was one of the remnants. And I'm making this carving. I think of it as a temple. Is what it tends to suggest, and it's also just a very simple abstract form, a relationship of positive and negative forms.
So did you start with the model?
I made several, trying to get what I wanted, and I arrived with this, and I proportioned the model to the original stone, and sometimes I do this, and sometimes I just start in and follow it through, develop it as it goes. It just all depends. Every time is a little bit different approach.
And what is the model? What material is that?
It's just clay. Okay. It's a modeling clay. That's a diamond blade, and it feels smooth. You can hardly feel any roughness at all, and yet it cuts the marble, it'll cut granite. It's just incredible what it does, and it just makes quicker, saves time on the roughing out process. We used to do all that just by hand, as I was with a hammer and chisel, but using this, it goes much faster.
So the first step would be to cut a line in it and then chisel out the material?
Yeah.
Is that generally always the way you work when you're working in stone?
Yeah, you have to rough it out, so to speak, like I'm roughing out this form, and then when I get it down approximately to where it belongs, I'll use carborundum stones and a grinder and part and get it smoothed out like the surface, and then eventually I'll have to polish the whole surface, and the polishing of a stone takes as long as it does to carve it.
And what do you use to polish the stone?
Different grits of carborundum stones.
Okay, the process of actually polishing the surface. How do you achieve that?
Well, you use water, and then you start out with a coarse grit carborundum stone, and then with a finer stone, rubbing on it, and we even have now these little diamond pads, which are much lighter and easier to handle, and you use several stones, each one with a finer grit, and when you get all the scratches out, you go to the next finer stone, and then when you get those scratches out, you go to the next, and then to put a final polish on it, you rub it with a felt pad and tin oxide powder.
Okay, Gordon, talk a little bit about the eye of vision and explain the crating and where it's come from and all that.
I will, but first I'd like to point out this sculpture just returned from the Stockton Museum, where we had a show, and it's still in the crate. The sculpture is called the Eye of Vision, and I did it in the desert where I have a studio, and I remember when I first was carving this hole, I was working from both sides, and I opened up a little hole about 1 inch in diameter, and I looked through it, and I saw a beautiful mountain in the distance, and so I've called this the Eye of Vision. And I'm sorry the crate is on it.
What kind of a stone is it, Gordon?
It's a black granite. You have a picture of another sculpture carved in the same stone but polished, which is really black, and this is just the split surface of the stone, which has this rough texture, but on a large piece sometimes that's appropriate. this piece is called the floater. It seemed to me that it just almost looks like it's going to float away. Yeah. Also is the black granite, and it's done with a technique that leaves that split surface, which is very it's really more work than making a polished surface. I won't try to describe the way it's done here, but I did leave a few drill holes just to indicate that it had been worked on. And I'd split off a large piece up in here, and it's a wonderful enduring stone. I always have the feeling that when you split this stone, that this is the first time in eons that this surface, it's the first time it's seen the light, and it's been there a long time. And I don't know, there is something about opening a stone up in that way that yeah.
What does a tool mark look like on a stone surface rather than what you call a split?
Well, there are different ways you can leave it with the texture of different tools, depending on the piece you're doing and what you want to do. And in this piece, to get this surface all over like this, here it's just the result of splitting off a piece. But all these other places, you have to make cut a little step in there, and then put a tool that's called a bull set in there, and hit it with a sledgehammer, and it knocks off a piece and leaves that surface. Then you have to move back and do the same thing here, and so you keep moving back till you come off the stone, and you always leave this split surface.
Is there one stone that you prefer working in over another? Or?
I'm partial to granite somehow. It's the stone I really learned the craft in, and it appeals to the romantic side of my nature, I guess, the enduring quality of stone, and that much of the earth is formed of stone, of granite. The whole Sierra Nevada mountains, for instance, that stick up 14,000 feet, the geologists say they go 25 miles down into the earth, just granite. It's all been come up from out of the heart of the earth. I'd like you to look at if you want to walk around here, look at the back from over here. It has a nice curve that you kind of don't get from the front of the stone. It helps establish the idea of the floater too, in a way. Yeah. Now you're getting rain, you better hold it.